How can luxury brands get away with charging so much for their clothing? And is the quality actually better than something you could get at Aritzia or even a store like Uniqlo? I'm a fashion designer, and today I'm going to take you on a little trip to my favorite high-end department store, and we're going to look at a couple sweaters in the $1,000+ range to see if the quality is any good. We're going to start with this mohair cardigan from Loewe. Spoiler alert, I do not think this is worth buying. I don't actually think the quality in some ways is meaningfully better than a fast fashion brand. But first we're going to go on a little nerdy journey so that you really understand why I think that. For those not familiar, Loewe is a luxury brand owned by luxury conglomerate LVMH, which owns Louis Vuitton and Dior, among others. This cardigan is selling for 2,150 Canadian dollars at Holt Renfrew, and on Loewe's US website that works out to 1,800 American. In terms of first impressions of the overall look, I would have loved to be able to try it on and show you, but this department store has these little tags that actually prevent you from really being able to try it on, so I tried and failed. But first things to note are that it has these placket details with buttons at both the center front and center back. I do appreciate that Loewe garments often have a quirky, whimsical touch to them, which can help basics appear, well, a little less basic. It is a knit, of course, and a very loose one at that. There are a lot of gaps between the stitches. Now, those of you who have watched my videos before may be able to guess already what I think of that, but we're not roasting right now, we're just observing. In terms of the fibers itself, it is quite fluffy. It has a bit of a halo to it. This is common with certain fiber types, including mohair, which this sweater is of course made of. To be more specific, it is 65% mohair, 29% polyamide, which for the purposes of this video, you can assume that most likely means nylon, 5% wool, and 1% elastane. So this is a blend of 4 different fiber types. Blends that are like 3 or 4 or more different fiber types kind of give me the ick. Now part of that is me, I guess, being a little bit biased and uppity and being like, why couldn't they afford 1 or 2 nice fibers instead of blending it with this like synthetic filler? And that is potentially a little bit unfair because I understand that sometimes synthetics are essentially necessary for performance. However, respectfully, this is a knit wool cardigan. I'm not sure what performance polyamide is actually adding here. So my hot take is that this was probably just added in there to save costs. And while it is my understanding that it is advantageous to blend mohair with other fibers when spinning it into a yarn, given the luxury positioning and price point, could we not have used, I don't know, silk or something instead? Or even like another type of wool. Maybe I'm just a hater and they did have a good technical reason for blending it with nearly 30% polyamide, but for the price point and type of garment that it is, the optics are just not good, in my opinion. The other reason that blends sometimes give me the ick is because it can make it more likely that a garment will pill. Now, I would be more concerned about that in a garment with a tighter knit. Given that this is so loose, I'm not particularly worried about it, but that's just something I thought I'd let you know. So obviously fiber content is something that influences the price of a garment. Mohair is certainly not known to be the cheapest fiber out there, so fine, I'll give it a pass on that front. In that sense, this sweater is most likely going to be higher quality than something you would get, I don't know, at Uniqlo or whatever. They're not probably sourcing really finely graded mohair over there. I'm hopping on here mid-edit to say that I've done a little bit more research, and it turns out that there are fast fashion brands, H&M notably, who are selling mohair blend sweaters. Now, as I explain later in the video, wools, including mohair, have different grades and levels of quality. So I'm going to give Loewe the benefit of the doubt here and assume that they source a high quality, high grade mohair for their sweater, and that these fashion brands are probably sourcing a lower grade, not quite as fine fiber for their own products. And I say I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt because I don't actually have any methods of checking. So okay, you get a gold star on that. However, construction is also an important factor that determines the price and overall quality of a garment. This is where it becomes important to understand the difference between fully fashioned knits and cut and sew knits. Now, I told you before that I was a fashion designer, and while that is true, that was a little bit sneaky because, full disclosure, I am not a knitwear designer. I do work in the apparel industry as a designer. However, I rarely work with knits in my day job beyond like t-shirts. So treat this part of the video as if it's coming from the perspective of an informed consumer as opposed to like a real expert. Let's jump into it. So cut and sew knits, which nice sweaters typically are not, are when you have a knit fabric like this wool jersey that I have at home, for instance. And the manufacturing facility would lay this out several layers thick and cut the pattern pieces out of the fabric. Then those pieces would be sewn together, usually with a serger to make the garment. This is common with t-shirts and also sweats. This Roots sweatshirt, which I've had for years, is actually a really good example. In this case, it has flat lock seams, not serge seams, but you can see there is a very clear sewn seam there. I've also got these pants here, and these are made from a knit jersey. You can see that these seams are serged, so that's another good example of a cut and sew knit. In contrast, knit sweaters, especially nice ones, are typically not cut and sew. They are usually fully fashioned knits. What that means is that a knitting machine will knit each panel from scratch to the appropriate size and shape, and then, if I understood correctly, the panels are knit together again using a knitting machine so that there is no sewing involved. They will have seams where the panels are joined together, often with noticeable little patterns called fashioning marks. You can see some examples of fully fashioned knits versus cut and sew knits in this blog from thecuttingclass.com, which shows some examples from an old Jill Sander collection that has both cut and sew knits where you can see a very clear sewn seam, and fully fashioned knits where the seams have those little fashioning marks instead of a distinctly sewn seam. It is also possible to have garments that are a mix of cut and sew and fully fashioned. However, this Loewe cardigan looks to be primarily or completely fully fashioned to me. You can see the fashioning marks in certain places, and while there are clear seams at the shoulders and sleeve, for instance, they don't look like distinctly sewn seams to me. If anybody knows more about me than knitwear and disagrees, please let me know in the comments so we can learn together. So you might be wondering, why does any of this matter? It matters because fully fashioned knits are typically more expensive to manufacture than cut and sew. So that means that if this were a cut and sew knit sweater, I would be like, are you freaking kidding me? Like, what do you mean you're selling this for $2,000 and it's a cut and sew knit? But it is not. It's a fully fashioned knit, so again, okay. Fine. As I said earlier though, I still wouldn't buy it and I don't think it's worth the money. Why? First of all, look at this placket. Now this is potentially partially the fault of Holt Renfrew for displaying it the way they did, but the placket at the top button is already kind of pulled out of shape and this is brand new. It doesn't look like it lies completely flat when buttoned, so even if you were to steam it and then store it properly, that warping would most likely still naturally happen when you wear it. You can see in product photos as well that it's not lying flat, it's pulling away. I don't like that. It's giving fast fashion. I literally talked about that with an H&M cardigan in my How to Shop for Quality video. And it means that that area is most likely going to weaken over time. And why would you pay that much money for something that is going to have that kind of problem? Another problem, in my opinion, is that this knit is very low gauge. What that means is that the number of stitches per inch is very low because there are a lot of gaps in between the stitches. Given that I'm not an expert in knitwear, I cannot tell you definitively that that is a sign of low quality. But what I can tell you definitively is that I sure as heck would not buy a sweater like that, especially not for that price, because you're going to get caught on everything. Your sweater is going to get caught on door handles, on the hardware of your purse, on your friend, like the zipper of their clothing or something when you give them a hug. You can borderline drive a truck through those gaps, they're so huge. Now this is somewhat of an aesthetic preference, I will admit, and some people probably do like the look of that looser knit, so fine, you're entitled to your opinion. Popping back in while editing again to say that most of the mohair sweaters that I was able to find online do appear to be a very loose knit. I'm not sure if that's just because that's how it's customarily done or if there's like a technical reason why the gauge has to be lower. Okay, I know I'm not an expert, but I feel like there's no reason you couldn't make it with a higher gauge, you know? If I'm wrong, please tell me. And regardless, I think it's pretty obvious that that doesn't change the fact that I don't like it. I could also play devil's advocate here and say, well, maybe this loose knit is actually the result of being knitted on a hand-operated knitting machine instead of a computerized one, which apparently typically results in a more open knit. The thing is, I doubt that's the case, and this is going to sound ironic given that I've just been yammering on about how expensive this sweater is, but I actually think the price point is too cheap for it to have been knit on a hand-operated machine, because anything done by hand is just going to take a lot more time. You might well be paying, and again, I don't know, this is a total stab in the dark, you might well be paying the operator a few $100s to knit a sweater with a hand-operated machine. And there's just no way, in my opinion, that a brand from a luxury conglomerate like this is going to be selling something that they had to pay hundreds of dollars in labor for only about $2,000. There are just too many people in that value chain who need to get paid, plus, you know, like bonuses and shareholders and all that. So yeah, I very highly doubt that it was made by a hand-operated machine. Maybe an $8,000 or $12,000 Bruno Cucinelli sweater might have been made that way. And yes, I would have loved to get my hands on one of those and reviewed them, but unfortunately they're usually behind a counter, closely guarded by the watchful eyes of salespeople, and I didn't want to get kicked out of the store, so here we are. The other thing is, if something is knitted on a hand-operated machine, brands will typically say that it's hand knit, so I'm sure if that were the case, Loewe would have said that. All that to say, I do not see a reason to buy a cardigan where the top of the placket is warping like that and where you're at a higher risk of snagging and threads coming loose. really at any price point, but especially not at $2,000. Next, we're going to discuss this McQueen sweater. It's retailing for $16.50 US on Neiman Marcus's website, $18.90 Canadian at Holt Renfrew. So I did get to miraculously try this one on. I don't love how it looks. I think it was probably designed for somebody a lot taller than me, which story of my life. Actually though, now that I'm looking at the product photos, I see that it looks like it was designed for the sleeves to be too long in general. Intriguing. I do always appreciate an interesting design detail that makes basics a little less basic, such as this asymmetrical flouncy hem. However, that doesn't mean I always love it on myself. Anyway, this looks like a mix of fully fashioned and cut and sew knit, which if you remember what I said about cut and sew knits, you'll understand why I'm like, You can see that the cuff and the neckband and the hem were not sewn on. That's fully fashioned. There was a seamless transition from the body of the garment to those parts. However, those look pretty distinctly like sewn seams at the shoulders and this large seam at center back. That seam is not the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. Maybe I'm just too picky about these things, but I think it would have looked a lot nicer if it was just one panel instead of massive seam all the way down center rack. I don't know enough about knits to know whether using sewn seams as opposed to fully fashioned seams in those places was a cost-saving measure or whether there was some technical reason like for shaping or something. Because I'm a hater, I'm going to assume the former. I'm going to assume this was a cost-saving measure. I may be wrong. In terms of fiber content, it is 97% cashmere and 3% wool. Now, cashmere is not a cheap fiber, especially if you get the good stuff. That said, not all cashmere is created equal. Like mohair, which the last sweater was made of, cashmere comes from the wool of a goat. And goats are living, breathing creatures. They're not wool machines. So some areas of their body are going to have longer, finer hairs than other areas. And goats of different ages may have different levels of fineness of their hair, etc. According to Sewport.com, which I view as a credible source for fabric-related questions, there are 3 grades of cashmere. You have grade C, which they say is the roughest and the cheapest, and is apparently commonly used in garments that don't have much contact with the skin. Now, grade B is very intriguing to me. It's a little better than grade C, but not as nice as grade A, as one would expect. But what I find intriguing is they say that mid-range cashmere varies widely in price. That's probably why you can find a lot of products labeled cashmere at a huge variety of price points, like from the designer level down to somewhere like Uniqlo or maybe even H&M for that matter. And then, of course, there's grade A. According to Sewport, grade A cashmere wool is universally expensive, and some types are much more expensive than others. Grade A cashmere fibers are longer and have a very fine diameter. According to a few sources, the diameter of grade A cashmere fiber is 14 to 16 microns. For a bit of a reference point, apparently human hair can vary between approximately 50 to 120 microns. That's one strand of human hair. Now, of course, I don't know how accurate that is. I'm not a hair expert, nor am I a micron expert. All that to say, what I want you to understand is that grade A cashmere fibers are exceedingly fine, and that's a huge part of the reason why it is so soft. So obviously, for a luxury brand like McQueen, and for the price point, I would assume that this sweater is made of grade A cashmere. It felt soft, the fibers looked fine from what I could tell. The gauge was also much higher on this sweater than on the Loewe cardigan, meaning that the number of stitches per inch is much higher. The stitches were much tighter. There really were not noticeable gaps between them. So overall, I just like that aesthetically much better. So this sweater is decent in my opinion, but there is something about that center back seam that I just can't get past. And I feel like it's so obvious that it's screaming, I'm a little bit cheap. Which, like, maybe it isn't. Again, maybe there's a reason why they did this. But it is giving cut and sew, like it looks pretty obviously like it was sewn. And I associate cut and sew on sweaters with cost savings. And when I'm looking to buy a luxury sweater, I don't want to be like, I see cost saving when I look at it. I don't want to see where you guys were cutting costs, you know? So would I buy either of these sweaters? The Loewe one, obviously no, because I don't like the low gauge knit. And I think the placket is problematic. For the McQueen one, also no. There aren't really any glaring problems with it that I can see. I'm just not really that crazy about the design. Now, do I think $1,000 or even more than that is an inherently problematic price point for a knit sweater? No, I don't. I think from independent makers or small brands who are using high quality wool yarns and are maybe even hand knitting the sweaters, whether that's on hand operated knitting machines or just like literally knitting with knitting needles, I think that paying a few $1,000s for a knit sweater under those conditions is entirely reasonable. I'm just not convinced on the value being proposed by these luxury brands whose sweaters are frankly not really that interesting design-wise and sometimes have construction problems. Alright, enough of my ranting and raving. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.